it rhymes throughout history the way that pagan countries would interact with demons,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And for those that may be hearing this for the first time, maybe didn't listen to some of those previous interviews, um, you know, when it says that the Babylonians or the Egyptians or the Philistines or any of these nations are worshiping false gods, they're not fake gods. These are
Yeah.
demons, right? And we can hash that out a little bit, but there's always a formula, and they always receive something, and it's usually information,
Mm.
right? So there's that whole way of going about it. I don't know if you want to jump into that, or if you want to go. What kind of route do you want to go? Because you've been looking into this.
No, I mean that's definitely something that you see, yeah, throughout cultures. And Paul makes the claim, is it in First or Second Corinthians, where he's like, "Hey, guys, these gods aren't even gods. Like, stop messing with them." And I think there is a pedagogy or a catechetical point to be like, stop messing around with it because it's not real. But I think, yeah, when Paul says it's not, he's saying that they're not true gods, right? They can't actually grant you anything of value.
Mm,
He's not saying they don't exist, right?
mhm.
Because he says, um, don't go to the communion table with demons.
Yep.
And then he doesn't say, oh, but demons aren't real, so don't worry about it. And then what does James say?
And even uses idols interchangeable. Like he uses like
Yeah, yeah.
idols and demons there, like two verses away to show like these idols, they're
Yeah.
demons, and they're what they really are is demons.
Right. I mean, and this is certainly, what Israel was going through when they were in Egypt. They weren't just like, oh, this is. So I just read this story of, oh, my mind's totally blank. It's midnight.
Yeah.
But this Greek explorer actually made landfall in Britain in like 325 BC or something. And he's looking at some of their gods. And then he goes back to Greece and he's like, oh, yeah, they worship Apollo. Which, no, they don't. Like, they've never heard of they may have some sort of god who has a similar idea as Apollo. And this was really popular in religious studies to be like, well, pagan cultures sort of, look at the sun and then they have a sun god. And that's why you have sun gods in all these different cultures. But these aren't just interchangeable sun gods. Even the Greeks and the Romans, which are culturally really similar, they try to, Mars and Ares, right? They're
Mm.
just like, oh, it's the same god of war or something like that. But yeah, I think it's important to remember that these things are that these forces, spirits, demons, whatever it is, they're not true in that they don't reveal truth, goodness, and beauty, but
Mm.
they're real in that they can reveal something. So you'd mentioned that there's always this idea of interchange. So the old Greek myth of Prometheus bringing fire. So that's how humans get fire in the Greek legends, is Prometheus gives them fire, and they're like, oh, we have this new invention now. Which at some point, right, when you're thinking about history, somebody says, hey, how did we figure out that you can have fire, right? Was it by accident? Did we just sort of, accidentally hit flint against steel at one point and make a spark? And then this myth is, well, there's two ways, right? The first is the myth is created to explain how fire got there. Or maybe at some point on a Greek island, somebody named Prometheus brought fire.
Mm.
And I don't think we have to be, we certainly don't have to be universalists to speak that way. We don't have to be conspiracy theorists to speak that way. But I think we should, if we sort of begin with this approach to myth and fiction as, well, let's just take it on its own terms, then it's really worth exploring. And yeah, since I'm the Jew guy, right? So in one of the ancient Jewish stories around the time of Jesus, it's this writing called Second Enoch. And you have, basically it's rooted in around the Noah story and the flood. You have Nephilim, and they're just kind of mentioned. They're called giants, heroes of renown, and then they disappear. They show up once in the book of Numbers, but scripture doesn't really tell us what they are. And so at one point in Jewish history, all of these theologians were like, hey, let's expand it. Let's figure out, let's write a story, or let's record a story to sort of explain these things. And in Second Enoch, these fallen angels, when they come down to earth, they give people things. So they give them, my favorite verse is, they teach women how to paint their faces.
Yep.
Which is fascinating because it's like, is makeup demonic? I would say no. I mean, I've never been asked that question, right? But it's probably worth thinking about, right? And certainly Paul, when he talks about don't braid your hair, right? There is an idea of sort of gussing yourself up to an extreme where you're only shooting for lust and adultery and things like that.
Yeah.
The fallen angels, they also bring medicines, drugs, prescriptions, war technology.
Alchemy, right?
Yeah, alchemy, all sorts of technologies.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's not scripture. It's a story. It's a story that postdates the characters it's writing about by thousands of years, right? So we don't want to take it too seriously, but we should. I think there's a value in entertaining that and saying, how is this? Is paganism simply recognizing that there's a sun and let's worship a sun god, or is paganism actually some sort of spiritual force?
Hmm. Yeah, because I've heard a couple people talk about this kind of historically, and like the Aztecs, for instance, right? That's one where I've heard some kind of talk extensively, and man, I don't even know if I want to get it. Like they would do some really dark stuff,
Yeah.
but there was always the way they would do that, right? So there would be sacrifices of humans in brutal ways, other things I don't even want to mention, other things I even more so don't want to mention. Like it just like it gets worse and worse. But there was always this like this prophet class, and they would they would do things with hallucinogens
Mhm.
connected with the sacrifices,
Right.
and then they would then present information that the Aztecs would then use. And they understood, at least this is how they would understand it, right? They understood that through this was how they understood what to do with their military campaigns, with their economic campaigns. So maybe, they're just off the rocker, and there's certainly there's at least a chance for that.
Mhm.
Maybe that some of that information they were giving was actually working for them, causing terror in that area, which they were doing, and they were successful militarily, they were successful economically, all those kind of things that nations strive towards. But they think they're getting this from their gods,
Mhm.
right? So from these demonic beings, and so the question is, were they right? And it seems like you've got that, but you've got other examples with certainly with like the Vikings on a much lesser degree, but still there. But then you get all this in the Old Testament, right? Where you kind of ask the question. Josh and I were talking about this, but why do the Israelites keep falling into idolatry?
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where if it's like, okay, like if people are, cosplaying, or goofing around or playing make believe, why is that so enticing to like fall into just make believe? And you can analyze that a little bit with kind of like the sinful nature. But it's like if these nations, which all the nations around Israel are almost always, with the exception of maybe the time of like David,
Mhm.
or maybe the time of like Joshua, they're almost always superior economically, superior architecturally, superior militarily,
Mhm.
and these nations think that part of the reason for that is because of their pagan worship, and because they do believe, many of them, that they're getting like information and help from demonic beings. That's a huge part of everything that they do. Why is Israel so attracted to that?
Mhm.
It would make sense if they're actually getting things.